In a $40 million mansion on the North Shore of Long Island, behind iron gates guarded by men with loaded weapons and Sicilian accents, a 61-year-old widow named Margot Orsini Vance was committing a murder so slow that even she didn't think of it as one. She called it medicine. She called it tradition. Every night at precisely 9 o'clock, she carried a silver tray up the grand staircase to the bedroom where her daughter-in-law waited, a quiet girl named Ember Holloway, 27 years old, the orphaned bartender from Queens who'd made the unforgivable mistake of marrying the most dangerous don in New York. Margot hated her. Not loudly, not with fists. She hated her the way old money hates new blood, with warm milk, whispered prayers, and a crystal glass that never quite tasted right. For 67 nights, Ember had smiled and thanked her. For 67 nights, Margot had watched her swallow, and for 60 of those 67 nights, that dead orchid on the windowsill had been drinking the poison instead. Because here's what the queen of the Orsini family didn't understand about the girl she'd dismissed as a gold-digging nobody. Ember had a degree in biochemistry from a city college in Manhattan, a best friend who ran the toxicology lab at NYU Langone, and a husband, Callahan Orsini, the man the underworld called the Undertaker, who was about to find out that the woman poisoning his wife was the same woman who'd killed his father. If you've ever smiled at someone while they were quietly destroying you, hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss a second of what's coming. Now let's rewind to the night Ember found the vial, and the moment she decided that running wasn't an option. 67 nights earlier, when the September rain was beating against the leaded glass panes of the Orsini mansion, Margot Orsini Vance stood in the middle of the grand dining room and looked at Ember Holloway with the eyes of someone counting every sin. In her hand, she held a silk handkerchief embroidered with the family crest, along with a line of Italian stitched in faded gold thread, and she spoke in that soft voice Ember had learned was the way a Sicilian woman cursed someone without ever needing to raise her tone. "This handkerchief belonged to my mother," Margot said, her dark red painted lips pressed into a thin line. "It vanished from my tea room this afternoon. No one entered that room except me and you." Ember stood still beside the crystal display cabinet, her hands still slightly damp from watering the plants, and she felt that familiar sensation slip down her spine like a cold strand of steel wire. This was the 7th time in 2 weeks that woman had accused her of stealing something. A pair of pearl earrings, a silver spoon engraved with the letter H, a calfskin-bound prayer book. Each time, Ember had found the item in exactly the place Margot knew she would have to pass, at exactly the hour Margot knew she would be there, and each time, she understood this wasn't the forgetfulness of an aging mother-in-law. These were tests. Ember bowed her head to the precise degree the woman demanded, kept her voice in the gentle tone she had practiced for 9 weeks, and said she would go look for it right away. Margot didn't answer. She merely turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the scent of vintage Chanel perfume mixed with something sharper, an herbal medicinal smell Ember had never been able to identify, and the sound of crocodile leather heels tapping across the walnut floor, until all that remained was the silence of a house too large for 2 women, neither of whom was willing to call the other mother. Ember waited a full 3 minutes, exactly as the rule she had set for herself required, then walked along the long hallway paved with white Carrara marble toward Margot's private tea room in the East Wing. That room always smelled of bergamot and dried roses, and the golden light from the antique Tiffany lamp was always turned so low it was barely enough to read by. She didn't switch on the ceiling light. She didn't touch the curtains. She only knelt beside the small rosewood tea table, where Margot arranged her imported tea tins the way other people displayed jewelry, and she pretended to search beneath the table for the handkerchief, while her green eyes swept across the room. She didn't find the handkerchief, because Margot had never truly misplaced it, but her hand accidentally brushed the Fortnum and Mason Earl Grey tin, the kind the woman ordered from London every quarter, and Ember felt that something inside it was wrong. The tin was heavier than it should have been. She opened the lid, and beneath the layer of dark brown dried tea leaves was a clear glass vial, as long as her little finger, unlabeled, sealed with a gray rubber stopper. Inside was a clear, colorless liquid, slightly thicker than water, and when she tilted the vial under the yellow light, she saw a distinctive band of refracted light that 4 years studying for a bachelor's degree in biochemistry at Hunter College had taught her how to recognize. This refractive index wasn't water. It wasn't vitamins. It wasn't anything a grandmother who loved her grandchild would keep in her tea tin. Ember's heart began beating in a way she had felt only once in her life, on the night at the bar called the Aurelian, 18 months earlier. The night she saw a cyanide capsule drop into the Negroni of a man whose name she didn't even know yet. She inhaled for 3 seconds, exhaled for 5 seconds. Exactly the technique of a night shift bartender. Exactly the technique of a biochemist handling an unknown substance. Then she opened her waist bag, took out the wine-red Dior lipstick she carried because Cal liked that shade, twisted the lipstick all the way up, and used her freshly washed little fingertip to place 1 drop of the liquid into the hollow inside the tube. 1 drop. Only 1 drop. Enough for Piper to test. Not enough for Margot to notice the volume had changed. She twisted the lipstick shut, slipped it into her bag, sealed the vial, wiped it with a damp tissue so she wouldn't leave a single fingerprint behind, then placed it back beneath the tea leaves at the exact angle where she had found it, tilted 22 degrees to the right. She remembered precisely, because a biochemist could forget many things, but a woman who had once mixed 200 cocktails a night never forgot an angle. When she stood up and stepped out of the tea room, her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs, but her hands, the hands accustomed to measuring liquor to the very milliliter under the flashing lights of a rooftop club, those hands didn't tremble even once. She closed the tea room door behind her, heard the latch slide into place with a soft little click, and in that moment, she knew her marriage had just entered a war that no one downstairs had yet realized had begun. But to understand why Ember's hands didn't tremble on that rainy night, one would have to go back another 1.5 years, to the first moment she saw a white pill fall into a stranger's glass on the 63rd floor of the Aurelian. It was March then, and the city was still bitterly cold beneath the winds sweeping in from the East River, while Ember stood behind the black onyx bar of the most prestigious rooftop club on Park Avenue, wearing the spotless white shirt she had washed by hand 3 times that week, because dry cleaning money was also Milo's asthma medicine money. She had been working the night shift there for 8 months, and she knew every rule of that room by heart. Men who drank old fashions were men who wanted to be seen. Men who drank martinis were men who wanted to be heard. And men who ordered Negronis in the original Milan recipe, London gin, Campari, and red vermouth in equal parts, stirred rather than shaken, orange peel instead of lemon peel. Those men usually came to watch someone without wanting anyone to watch them back. That night, there was a table of 8 men seated in the private section near the glass overlooking Central Park, all of them dressed in suits tailored in Milan, and among them, the one seated in the deepest corner, was a 36-year-old man with short-cut black hair, a faint scar running along his left jawbone, and the gray eyes of someone who hadn't slept normally in at least a decade. Ember noticed him because he wasn't drinking. He only sat there looking at his phone, his finger tapping against the tabletop in a rhythm she recognized as Morse code, though she couldn't decode it. Then a blonde man in a gray suit, sitting alone at the bar, ordered a Negroni for the man in black at that corner table, told her to bring it over, personally, and added a $50 tip that was far too generous for a $40 cocktail. Ember nodded and turned her back to mix the drink. And when she turned around to pick up the silver tray, she saw it. The blonde man's left hand moved across the mouth of the glass for 1 second with exactly the speed of a street magician switching a card, and a small white pill the size of a toothpick tip dropped into the red liquor and sank to the bottom in less than 2 seconds. Ember had read about potassium cyanide during a toxicology course in her 3rd year. She knew it dissolved in alcohol more slowly than in hot water, knew it had no smell until it met stomach acid, and knew that in a compressed dose like that pill, a grown man would collapse to the floor within about 2 to 4 minutes after the first sip. She didn't scream. She didn't look twice. She simply stepped toward the tray, reached out her hand, and right before her fingers touched the stem of the glass, she deliberately slipped on a patch of water on the floor that she had noticed from the beginning of her shift. The glass tipped over, red liquor splashed across the sleeve of her white shirt, and she cried out an apology that sounded just panicked enough to make sense. The bar supervisor, a man named Desmond who had worked there for 15 years, looked at her from the other side. Ember looked back at him, and she made a gesture with her left hand that they had long ago agreed on for troublesome guests. 3 fingers pressed together against her chin, then swept sideways. Desmond didn't ask. He pressed the button beneath the bar within 1.5 seconds. 30 seconds later, 2 men in black, not club security but men from the table of 8, were standing behind the blonde man, and he was lifted from his chair before he could set down his own drink. No one else in the room saw anything. The jazz music was still playing Chet Baker, and at the corner table, the man with the scar along his jaw finally looked up from his phone for the first time all evening and stared straight at her. 5 minutes later, while Ember was wiping the spill from the floor with an alcohol-soaked cloth, he stood up and walked past her. He didn't say thank you. He only placed a black business card with no printed words on the onyx bar top, and he said in a low, hoarse voice she would remember for the rest of her life, "You just saved my life. What do you want?" Ember looked up, and for the first time, she looked straight into those gray eyes, the eyes of a man the entire room was silently afraid of, though no one dared say his name. She thought of Milo lying in a hospital room in Queens, with a leaking mitral valve that the Medicaid doctors had refused to operate on because the boy was considered low priority. She thought of her father's $47,000 hospital debt that she was still paying off in installments. She thought of the envelope in the kitchen cabinet drawer where she had written, "Open this when you're no longer with me," for her 9-year-old brother. And she said, in a calm voice she didn't know she possessed, "I need heart surgery for my brother." No strings attached. That man, Callahan Orsini, didn't ask a single additional question. He only nodded once, picked up the black business card, and wrote on the back with a black fountain pen, "New York Presbyterian, 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, your name at reception." At 10 o'clock the next morning, when Ember walked into the lobby of the finest cardiovascular hospital in the city and gave her name to the woman at the reception desk, the woman asked her only one question, "You're Miss Holloway, aren't you?" Then handed her a 60-page file with every expense already paid in advance, the top surgeon in the northeastern United States personally assigned, and a handwritten note in black ink that said only 2 words, "No strings," with CO signed hurriedly beneath it. Those 2 words, "No strings," should have been the last 2 words Ember ever heard from Callahan Orsini. A clean transaction between a woman who owed a debt of gratitude and a man who didn't want to owe anyone anything. But on the following Thursday, he returned to the Aurelian bar. He didn't drink. He only sat at the same corner table, ordered Fugi mineral water with no ice, and watched her work for 3 full hours. He didn't start a conversation. He didn't leave a tip. He did nothing at all, except be there, close enough for her to feel him, far enough that she couldn't complain. The Thursday after that, he came again. Then, the Thursday after that. By the 5th week, Desmond tilted his head toward Ember behind the bar and whispered, "Do you know who that man is?" Ember answered by polishing the crystal glass for the 3rd time. She knew. She had read the New York Post the morning after the night she spilled the drink. She had seen the black and white photograph printed on page 6, with a caption about the federal investigation into the Orsini family, and she had seen the nickname people used for him in that world, the Undertaker, the nickname no one dared say out loud in a room with more than 3 people. She knew whose life she had saved. She knew where the money that paid for Milo's surgery had come from. But she also knew that at 25, with a little brother born with a heart defect and $47,000 in hospital debt from her dead father, people didn't have the privilege of clean choices. On the 9th Thursday night, when the first summer rain poured down over the city so suddenly that taxis stopped running for 30 minutes, Cal stood up from his corner table for the first time, walked across the bar, and asked her in that low, hoarse voice that hadn't changed since the first night, "Where are you headed?" Ember answered, "Queens, 37th Street. He nodded. "My car is downstairs." Ember had no umbrella. Her shoes had leather soles, and the clock on the wall read 11:42 at night. She followed him down the elevator. The black Rolls-Royce Ghost was parked right in front of the lobby. The driver didn't look up at her once, and for the entire 40-minute ride across the Queensboro Bridge, beneath the rain, Cal said nothing until the car stopped in front of the 4th-floor apartment in her old red brick building. Only then did he turn his head to look at her, and he said, "In that room full of liars that night, you were the only one who didn't bow your head. I spent 18 years waiting to meet someone like you." Ember didn't know how to answer, so she only opened the car door, stepped out into the rain, and climbed 4 flights of stairs with her heart beating in a rhythm she didn't recognize. The next 6 months passed like a slow-motion film she couldn't believe she was the main character of. He took her to dinner at places whose names she had never heard. He remembered that she couldn't eat seafood. He sent a private nurse to check on Milo once every 3 days without asking her permission. He read her biochemistry books more closely than she did, and asked questions about enzyme structures like a 4th-year student. And 6 months after that rainy night, he took her to Brooklyn Harbor at 4:45 in the morning, at the exact moment the sun began casting its first copper streaks across the water. He didn't kneel. He simply stood facing her, took out a vintage platinum ring with a square diamond that didn't have a single modern cut, the ring his birth mother had worn before she died of cancer when he was 12, and he said, "Ember, I'm not a good man, but I'll be the best man to you I can become." She said yes before he could finish the sentence. Their wedding took place 3 months later, not at St. Patrick's Cathedral as a Dawn of the Five Families should have done, but at St. Anthony of Padua Church on Sullivan Street in Little Italy, the small brown brick church where Cal's great-grandfather had married his wife in 1921, and where Hugo Orsini had told his son before he died, "When you marry your real woman, marry her there. Don't marry her where the press is already waiting." 30 guests, no reporters, no extravagant white flowers, only beeswax candles, an old organ, and Father Dominic Palermo's voice, singing Ave Maria in Latin. Ember wore the simple white dress she had chosen herself from a small shop in Brooklyn. Cal wore a black suit tailored on Neapolitan Row. And in the front pew on the groom's side, there were only 2 people. The first was Margot Orsini Vance, 60.5 years old then, still dressed in black as if it were the year her husband died, and she watched Ember walk down the aisle with a smile that anyone in the room would have mistaken for the smile of a mother welcoming her daughter-in-law, except Ember, who had studied enough chemistry to know that some poisons had no smell until after they had already been swallowed. The second sat 3 seats away from Margot, a 27-year-old woman named Rosa Beaumont, the only daughter of Don Beaumont of the New Orleans family, wearing an emerald green dress 10 times more expensive than the bride's, and she was smiling too, a smile as cold as metal, the smile of someone waiting for a show she had already bought a ticket to, the smile of someone who knew that the ceremony that day wasn't the ending, but only the opening line of a play whose script she had finished reading long ago. Rosa Beaumont's cold, metallic smile was the first thing Ember thought of when the car carried her away from St. Anthony of Padua Church, 3 hours after the wedding, but she didn't have time to think about it for long, because the Bentley Cal had prepared drove straight across the Queensboro Bridge onto Interstate 495, and 72 minutes later stopped before a wrought iron gate 4 meters high in Oyster Bay, on the north shore of Long Island, the gate that from that night onward would become the boundary between her old life and the new life, whose terms she hadn't had time to read in full. The Orsini mansion appeared beyond that gate like a crouching stone beast, a 3-story Georgian house built in 1928 from Indiana limestone, with 14 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a private baseball field in the southeast corner that Cal said hadn't been used since Hugo died, and a helicopter pad behind the Italian garden where ancient cypress trees were planted in straight rows like soldiers standing guard. Ember sat in the back seat, holding Cal's hand, and she tried not to think about the 4th-floor apartment in Queens where she had lived for the past 7 years, that 450-square-foot apartment with one window facing the train tracks. Cal took her up to the master bedroom in the west wing on the 2nd floor, a room larger than her entire old apartment, and he said, "I have to go to Chicago tomorrow morning. There's something at Brooklyn Harbor I have to settle in Chicago first. About 10 weeks, maybe longer." Ember didn't ask why something at Brooklyn Harbor had to be settled in Chicago. She had learned that there were questions an Orsini wife shouldn't ask. She only nodded, kissed him on the forehead, and said, "I'll be fine." The next morning, when Cal's black Sikorsky helicopter lifted off from the pad in the back at 6:15, Ember stood on the bedroom balcony watching him disappear into the low clouds. And in that moment she felt something very small, very vague, as if some door inside this house had just locked behind her before she had managed to see who turned the key. On the second day after Cal left, at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the mansion's chief housekeeper, a woman named Constance, who had worked there for 41 years, knocked on her door and said Mrs. Orsini Vance wanted to see her in the library. Ember had expected it. She put on the simplest outfit she owned, black trousers, a gray cashmere sweater, no makeup except a light layer of lipstick, and she went down the Carrara marble spiral staircase she had walked through in her wedding dress 2 nights earlier. The library of the Orsini mansion sat in the east wing on the 1st floor, a 2-story rectangular room with black walnut bookshelves covering all 4 walls, holding more than 12,000 books Hugo had collected from auctions in Lunihide and Geneva over 4 decades. Margot sat in the only wine-colored leather chair placed opposite the marble fireplace, legs crossed, one hand holding an espresso cup that had gone cold, and she didn't stand when Ember entered. She didn't invite her to sit either. She only pointed one emerald-ringed finger toward the Persian rug beneath her feet. And when Ember stood in that place, exactly 3 steps away from her. She began speaking in English, in a low, even voice like someone reading a deposition. First rule: you never call me mother. You call me Mrs. Orsini Vance, because you're not my daughter, and you'll never be my daughter. Second rule: you don't leave the grounds of this mansion unless I'm with you, or I give written permission, because of family security matters. Do you understand? Third rule: the people who work in this house have served 3 generations of Orsinis. They don't serve you. You clean your own room, wash your own clothes, prepare your own breakfast. Constance will only cook the 2 main meals because that is the work she contracted with my husband before he died. Fourth rule: each week you'll memorize 7 rituals from this book. She placed a worn black calfskin-bound notebook written in Old Italian on the table before her. 47 rituals, 6 weeks. You'll know how to greet every rank in the family, how to pour wine for a don, how to recite the rosary in Sicilian, how to receive a capo, how to refuse a rival family without starting a war. And if you don't recite the correct 7 rituals every Saturday, that week you won't be allowed to call your brother. And the final rule: she took a sip of cold espresso. She didn't look at Ember. Every morning you'll wake at 5 o'clock. Come down to this library and wipe every book in the 4 shelves on the left with a lambskin cloth. I don't tolerate dust on my husband's legacy. Do you have any questions? Ember had no questions. She only bowed her head exactly 15 degrees, the precise angle a traditional Sicilian daughter-in-law was supposed to bow before a Don's widow, and she said, "Yes, Mrs. Orsini Vance." That night, at 9 o'clock, Constance knocked on her bedroom door and brought in a silver tray, and on that tray was a crystal glass engraved with an old letter O, holding warm, ivory white milk, with a thin layer of honey foam floating on the surface. Behind Constance stood Margot, her hands folded in front of her stomach, and she smiled for the first time that day, a smile Ember would learn to remember in the nights that followed. "This is an Orsini tradition, my dear," she said, her voice soft as silk dipped in water. "Every bride who has entered this house, since my husband's great-grandmother in 1883, has drunk a glass of warm milk with honey every night during the first year, so her body can prepare to give birth to the eldest grandson, who will carry on the family line. Drink it. I'll stand here until you finish it." Exactly 48 hours after the night, Ember hid the vial of liquid sample inside the wine-red Dior lipstick. She asked Margot for permission to visit Milo at St. Vincent's Children's Home in Astoria, because the boy had suffered a mild asthma attack the week before, and the doctor had advised that a relative come sit with him for at least 1 visit. Margot approved with a nod without looking up from the Town and Country magazine she was reading, on the condition that Ember had to go with a driver named Bernard, whom Margot had personally chosen, and had to return to the mansion before 7 o'clock that evening. Ember agreed. She sat in the back seat of the Mercedes Maybach for the first 20 minutes, clutching the Celine handbag Cal had bought her on their honeymoon, and inside that bag, resting between a goatskin notebook and a wallet, was the lipstick containing something that could be evidence in a crime, or could simply be the paranoia of a poor girl made frantic by her new life. When the car stopped at the children's home, she visited Milo for exactly 30 minutes. Enough to hug the boy, enough to tell him about the golden retriever Cal had promised to buy when he came home, and enough to kiss his forehead 3 times in the exact order their mother had kissed him since Milo was still a tiny, red-faced baby. Then she told Bernard she needed to stop by the Duane Reade Pharmacy on 35th Street to buy more asthma medicine for her brother, and while the driver waited outside in the car, she walked 3 blocks east, hailed a yellow taxi, and went straight to the NYU Langone Medical Center building on First Avenue. Piper Lockwood was waiting for her at the back entrance of the toxicology lab in the basement, her hair twisted into a messy high bun, wearing a white lab coat stained with a coffee mark. The 2 of them had been best friends since their first year at Hunter College, from the day Piper spilled a test tube of diluted sulfuric acid solution onto Ember's shoe, and both of them laughed like maniacs in the restroom for 20 minutes. Piper didn't ask why. She only took the lipstick, opened it inside the fume hood, and said, 3 days. I'll call you. 3 days later, at exactly 4:17 on Thursday afternoon, Ember received a call from an unknown number while she was wiping the 391st book on the left shelf of the library. She stepped out into the rose garden behind the house, where there were no cameras of the kind Margot usually placed, and Piper spoke in a voice Ember had only heard once before, the night Piper's father died of a heart attack. "Ember, the sample you gave me. It isn't a vitamin. It isn't a sleeping pill. It's a synthetic mixture made of 2 substances, misoprostol reformulated so it doesn't cause immediate contractions, and a derivative of leuprolide acetate that I haven't seen in any commercial pharmaceutical literature, which means someone synthesized it in a private lab. The dose in your sample is enough that, if taken continuously, for around 90 to 120 days, it would cause permanent infertility, irreversible, with no antidote. And the most important thing is that it's completely odorless and tasteless when mixed into warm milk or any liquid with a fat content above 4%. Ember stood in the middle of the rose garden, phone in hand, and for about 3 seconds she heard her heartbeat pounding at both temples. "Are you sure?" Piper answered. "I ran the sample 3 times. I'm sure, Ember. Who's giving you this to drink?" Ember didn't answer that question. She only said, "Thank you. Keep the remaining sample in the freezer. Don't tell anyone, not even your husband." Then she hung up. She stood among the white rose beds for 5 full minutes, and in those 5 minutes, she allowed herself to understand one thing. Margot didn't want to kill her. She had never wanted to kill her. Killing Adon's wife would start a war that even Margot couldn't control. What she wanted was something quieter, crueler, more legal. She wanted to take from Ember the ability to give birth to a child with Orsini blood, so that after 9 months or a year, when Callahan realized his wife couldn't give him an heir, she would bring in Dr. Quentin Fairchild with a forged medical file already signed, declare that Ember had been infertile from birth, and force Cal to divorce her so he could marry another woman who had already been chosen in the front pew of St. Anthony's Church. The target had never been Ember. The target was the unborn child. That night, when Constance brought the warm milk up to her room, and Margot stood waiting at the threshold with her silk-dipped-in-water smile, Ember held the glass of milk in both hands, looked straight into the woman's eyes, and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Orsini Vance. I'm feeling a little tired today. May I drink it in the bathroom while I take a hot bath to ease my headache?" Margot nodded, turned away, and closed the bedroom door behind her. Ember waited 30 seconds. Then she walked to the purple Phalaenopsis orchid Cal had placed on the windowsill as a wedding gift, the flower his mother had grown in the family's first house in Sicily, and she poured the entire glass of milk into the base of the plant, drop by drop, until the crystal was dry and clean. On that very first night, Ember knew she wasn't allowed to run, wasn't allowed to cry, and wasn't allowed to let anyone in this house see that she was strong. She had to become exactly the woman Margot was waiting for, a tired wife, dizzy, forgetful of the servants' names, confused about the hours of the day, prey slowly curling into the trap it had seen clearly all along. By the 40th night since Ember had begun playing the role of a wife slowly losing herself, the purple Phalaenopsis orchid on the windowsill had turned brown at the tips of its roots, and its 2 smallest stems had fallen to the floor, while Ember had learned how to walk half a second slower than usual, learned how to lift her eyes as though she were trying to remember Constance's name, and learned how to let her voice fall into the vague rhythm Margot had been waiting for. She had thought the game was only in the glass of milk. She had been wrong. That night, at around 1:12 in the morning, when the October wind swept through the stone chimneys of the Orsini mansion and made a low whistling sound over the roof, Ember was lying in bed pretending to sleep in the left-side position she had practiced, when she heard it, a very faint, steady scraping sound. Not the ticking of the pendulum, not the contraction of old wood at night, but the sound of a small piece of metal turning back and forth inside a sealed box, coming from the 2-meter-tall Swiss grandfather clock made of black walnut in the west corner of the room. The clock, Cal said, had belonged to his grandfather since 1938. Ember didn't sit up. She didn't open her eyes. She only counted her breaths for another 45 seconds, then turned over like someone dreaming, and crawled out of bed with the sluggishness of a drunk person going to the bathroom in the middle of the night, stepping barefoot to the vanity table, picking up a silver spoon engraved with Italian patterns that Constance had brought up with the milk that night and forgotten to take back down. She held the spoon behind her back, walked toward the grandfather clock with the gait of someone trying to find her way to the bathroom, and as she passed it, she gently turned the concave side of the spoon toward the clock glass. The silver surface reflected, and within 1/10 of a second, Ember saw it. A tiny purple dot, smaller than the point of a needle, flashed and disappeared behind the brass pendulum as it swung past. She knew what it was. 4 years of college hadn't taught her about surveillance cameras, but 6 months working the night shift at the Aurelian had taught her that the infrared indicator light of modern hidden cameras emitted a wavelength of around 850 nanometers. and it only appeared under reflected light at a certain angle, the kind of angle a curved concave silver spoon could accidentally create for 0.3 of a second. She kept walking to the bathroom. She didn't turn her head. She didn't change her breathing. She turned on the faucet, sat on the edge of the marble bathtub, and allowed her hands to tremble for the first time since the night in the tea room. 30 seconds. Exactly 30 seconds. Then she stood, washed her face, and went back to bed. She didn't remove the camera. Taking it down would be the stupidest mistake she could possibly make, because Margot would know within an hour that her prey had awakened, and the entire 6-week advantage Ember had built by playing her role would disappear. Instead, she decided to do something harder, something only a woman who had stood behind a bar serving high-society customers for 8 months would have enough nervous discipline to do. She would perform for it. The next morning, at 6:12, when Constance brought a light breakfast up to her room, Ember pretended to trip over the edge of the Persian rug and drop the pair of glasses she had started wearing in the 3rd week. The tortoiseshell-framed glasses she didn't actually need, but that served as the perfect prop. She looked at Constance with slightly distant eyes and asked, "Constance, what day is it today? I'm sure I've already asked you, haven't I?" Constance answered, "Wednesday, ma'am." 2 minutes later, when she set the coffee tray down, Ember asked again, "I'm sorry, Constance. What day is it today? My mind feels so tangled today." Constance answered once more, "Wednesday, ma'am." And when Ember sat at the table and lifted the coffee cup, she looked down at her own hand as though she had just discovered it. Then asked a 3rd time, her voice faintly panicked, "Constance, I'm sorry. What day is it today?" Constance placed a hand on her shoulder with the gesture that a woman who had worked in this house for 41 years reserved only for people she pitied, and she said gently, "Wednesday, Mrs. Callahan. Would you like me to call Dr. Fairchild to come earlier than scheduled?" Ember shook her head weakly. "No, Constance. I just need a little more sleep." Downstairs, in the small study behind the library, Margot Orsini Vance sat before a 27-inch computer monitor hidden inside a black walnut drawer, and she watched the entire scene through the camera concealed in the grandfather clock with a resolution sharper than television. She took a sip of espresso, tilted her head toward Constance as she left the room on the screen, and said aloud to herself in Italian, "The prey is within reach now. We only have to wait until she can no longer stand on her own." On the following Friday afternoon, at exactly 3 o'clock, the bell at the Orsini mansion gate rang, and Constance announced over the internal phone that Dr. Quentin Fairchild had arrived on time for the routine examination. Mrs. Orsini Vance had scheduled 3 weeks earlier, an appointment Ember had never been told about until that morning, when Margot knocked on her bedroom door at 11:40 and said in that falsely gentle voice, "Daughter, you're about to have an important guest, the family's private doctor, since your husband's grandfather's time. He wants to check your reproductive health to make sure everything is ready for the first year." Ember only nodded vaguely, exactly the kind of nod the camera inside the grandfather clock had recorded for the past 3 weeks, and she said, "Yes, ma'am." Dr. Fairchild entered the small sitting room in the West Wing at 3:07, a 54-year-old man with silver hair combed back until it shone like wax, a white coat, tailored so precisely it certainly wasn't a hospital uniform, and in his right hand was a black crocodile leather briefcase. Ember estimated to be worth at least $8,000. But what held her gaze the longest wasn't the briefcase. It was the watch on his left wrist, a stainless steel Patek Philippe Nautilus with a blue dial, the version she remembered reading about in a magazine while waiting at the New York Presbyterian reception desk on the day she took Milo in for surgery, the version with a secondary market price of around $160,000, a price that an obstetrician-gynecologist working at a mid-level private hospital like Lenox Hill, with an average salary of $400,000 a year, could afford if he saved for 5 years without eating or spending a dime, or if someone was paying him outside the examination bill. He shook her hand. His hand was cold and dry. He smiled at the exact professional angle an obstetrician-gynecologist had practiced for 30 years, but during the first 6 seconds of their conversation, he didn't look directly into her eyes once. He looked at the coffee table. He looked at the dying orchid on the windowsill. He looked at her platinum wedding ring. He looked at his own left wrist. But he didn't look into her eyes. Ember had mixed 200 cocktails a night for 8 months, and she knew one simple truth about human beings: that an honest man could be silent, could be nervous, could even be rude, but a man taking part in the destruction of your life would avoid your eyes in one very specific way, the way of someone who didn't want your face carved into his memory, in case someone asked later. Dr. Fairchild carried out what he called a routine examination for 42 minutes, measuring her blood pressure, listening to her heart, checking her thyroid, asking a few questions about her menstrual cycle that Ember answered in the vague voice she had practiced. And then, in the final minute, he took out 4 vacuum tubes, red, purple, green, and yellow, and said in his professionally reassuring tone that he needed to draw 4 blood samples to run a comprehensive panel on ovarian function, follicle-stimulating hormone, estradiol, AMH, and a basic genetic panel, that the results would be ready in about 10 days, and that this had been standard procedure for new brides in this family since Donna Isabella's time. Ember held out her arm. She didn't object. She even asked a foolish question about whether she should have fasted, a question anyone with a bachelor's degree in biochemistry would know was unnecessary for the tests he had just listed. He drew her blood in 3 minutes, labeled the tubes with a black ink pen, writing Ember Holloway, Orsini, and the date, then closed his briefcase, wished her good health, and left the mansion at 3:51 in the afternoon. That night, as Ember sat before the mirror, removing the pearl earrings Margot had lent her for the appointment, she knew very clearly that those 4 tubes of blood would never go to any laboratory. They would go straight into Fairchild's freezer, where he would wait until the necessary day, then switch the sample with the blood of another woman who had already been diagnosed with congenital infertility, a woman who didn't exist, or existed under another name, and the final result would be legally stamped on the letterhead of a private clinic in Manhattan, strong enough to hold up before any divorce judge in Nassau County Court. The woman wasn't only poisoning her, she was building a file. 18 nights after Dr. Fairchild's visit, meaning the 58th night since the first glass of milk, the smell of melted butter and grated lemon peel spread through the ground floor of the Orsini mansion at 9:15 in the evening, a scent Ember hadn't once smelled in this house during nearly 2 months there, because Margot Orsini Vance had never gone down to the kitchen, had never made anything with her own hands, except pour espresso for herself at 6 o'clock in the morning. Constance appeared at Ember's bedroom door at 9:22, her hands folded before her stomach, and she said in a voice that carried a faint hesitation, "Ma'am, Mrs. Orsini Vance would like to invite you down to the kitchen for tea. She has just made canestrelli." Ember slipped a thin sweater over her pajamas and walked down the stairs barefoot, with exactly the gait of a tired woman who had been invited to a late-night snack and didn't have the strength to refuse. The Orsini mansion kitchen was nearly 100 square feet, paved in Calicut marble, and at the center island stood Margot, wearing a black silk apron embroidered with the letter M in gold thread, a silver spoon in her hand as she stirred the last batch of dough, and in front of her was a plate of canestrelli fresh from the oven, pale yellow, 6-petaled flower-shaped cookies dusted with powdered sugar, the specialty pastry of Liguria that Margot's grandmother had taught her to make in Genoa when she was 12. She looked up when Ember stepped in, and she smiled. A smile Ember hadn't seen on her face once in nearly 3 months of marriage, the smile of a woman trying to appear as a mother for the first time and also for the last. "Sit down, daughter," she said. "I want to speak properly with you." Ember sat on the tall oak chair across from her, and Margot pushed the plate of cookies toward her, poured her a cup of chamomile tea herself, and began speaking in the gentle voice Ember immediately recognized as the voice of someone moving into the final strike. "I have watched you these past 9 weeks, Margot said, her hand still stirring her own tea clockwise. "I see that you're growing weaker. You can't sleep. You forget the servants' names. You even forget the day of the week. This isn't the life you were born to live, Ember. You're a smart girl from Queens. You deserve a life where you can breathe, not a golden cage on Long Island, where you have to learn 47 rituals in a language you don't speak." Ember bit into a canestrelli, the taste of butter and lemon, and a faint hint of fragrant rice melting on her tongue, and she said nothing. Margot continued, "I spoke with Callahan on the phone last week. He doesn't know I called. But I have arranged something that I believe will be best for everyone. $2 million transferred into your private account within 48 hours after you sign an uncontested divorce petition, plus a lifelong education fund for Milo at any private school you choose, plus an apartment on 30th Avenue on the Upper West Side in your name. All of it legal, all of it discreet. You won't have to say a single word to the press. Callahan will believe you left voluntarily because you couldn't endure this life, and he will hurt for a while, then forget. Orsini men always forget. That is what this family does best. Ember chewed slowly, swallowed, and set the remaining piece of cookie back on the plate. Then she looked up, looked directly into Margot's icy blue eyes for the first time since the night in the library, and in a voice she had practiced in her mind for the past 3 weeks in case she ever needed it, she said, "Mrs. Orsini Vance, I'm very grateful for your concern, but I can't sign the divorce papers, because I've been pregnant for 9 weeks. Dr. Fairchild doesn't know yet because I only took a home test this morning. I was planning to wait until Cal came back from Chicago before telling him." The silver spoon in Margot's hand fell onto the marble counter. The sound of metal striking stone rang through the kitchen for 2 full seconds before fading. In those 2 seconds, Ember saw something she would never forget. The face of the woman sitting across from her turning deathly pale beneath the expensive MAC foundation, the muscle in her jaw twitching once beyond her control, and her pupils shrinking into 2 small black points, the unmistakable biological reaction of a predator who had just realized the prey was counting down faster than she had estimated. Then, in less than 3 seconds, Margot picked up the spoon again, laughed softly, and said, "Oh, daughter, that is the most wonderful news this house has heard in 10 years. That night, after Ember returned to her room, after she pretended to drink the glass of warm milk Constance brought up at 11 o'clock, after she poured it into the orchid that was already 2/3 dead, she texted Piper one single line. "Can you come collect a new sample tomorrow? I need to know today's dose." 2 days later, Piper called back in the voice Ember had heard only twice in her life. "The dose has doubled. She's trying to kill even the fetus you don't have yet." On the Tuesday morning after the conversation in the kitchen, Ember told Margot that Dr. Fairchild had advised her to get an early prenatal examination at a specialized obstetrics clinic in Manhattan because there had been 2 cases of early miscarriage in her family history, a detail Margot couldn't verify without calling Fairchild directly, and doing that would make Ember suspicious, so she only nodded and allowed Bernard to drive her to Moynihan Train Hall at 9 o'clock in the morning. But Ember didn't walk into any clinic in Manhattan. She went straight to the Amtrak ticket counter, bought a one-way ticket on the Vermonter number 56 to Burlington, with cash withdrawn from an old savings account. Cal didn't know she still kept, and boarded the train at 9:45 with a simple black backpack, a wool beanie pulled low, and her phone powered off from the moment she left Bernard. The train ride lasted 9 hours and 32 minutes, crossing the Hudson River, passing through the Adirondack valleys already turning yellow in late autumn, and when she stepped down onto the Burlington platform at 7:20 in the evening, a dark red Ford F-150 pickup truck was already waiting, driven by a 68-year-old man wearing a red and black plaid wool coat, his silver hair cut short in a military style, and pale blue eyes belonging to a man used to reading people from 50 meters away. She didn't need to ask. Thaddeus Winterbourne nodded once and said, "Get in, Miss Holloway. The drive to my house takes 40 minutes, and tonight's going to be colder than I expected." Thaddeus's wooden house sat deep in the maple forest outside Charlotte, 3 miles east of Lake Champlain, a 1-story cedar-clad house weathered silver gray by 4 decades of lake wind, with a stone chimney steadily breathing white smoke into the October sky. And when Ember got out of the truck, she saw a half-split pile of firewood beside the porch, a long-handled axe lodged in an oak chopping block, exactly the first image Thaddeus wanted her to see, so she would understand that this man, though he had once been the second most powerful consigliere of the Orsini family for 26 years, had now withdrawn into a life made only of axes, wood, and waiting. He made her a cup of unsweetened black tea, set it on the rough wooden table before her, and sat down in the chair across from her. Hugo told me once, in the summer he was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. When I suggested that he reveal the illness to Callahan, he shook his head and said these exact words, "Thaddeus, if one day Callahan truly marries a woman he loves, not for the family, that girl will need you, not me." He looked straight at Ember. "I've waited 4 years for you to come here, Miss Holloway." He stood, went to the wall behind the fireplace, removed a cheap oil painting of a Lake Como landscape, and behind it was the steel face of a medium-sized Liberty safe. He turned the combination 3 times, opened the door, and took out 3 things, placing them before her. The first was a brown leather-bound legal file about 40 pages thick, stamped with the seal of the office of Thaddeus Winterbourne, Esquire, and signed by Hugo Orsini on March 2nd of that year, exactly 6 weeks before he died. "This is Hugo's real will," Thaddeus said. The version Margot submitted to probate court after the funeral, the version Callahan read and trusted, was a forged version staged by her private lawyer, a man named Leland Crawford, whom I didn't have enough evidence to expose at the time. The second was a tightly typed A4 sheet, listing 14 names of people inside and outside the Orsini family, with a short note beside each name, written by Hugo himself, in midnight blue fountain pen. "This is the list of the 14 people Hugo no longer trusted," Thaddeus said, arranged in descending order of danger. "The first name you already know. The second is Callahan's cousin named Finn, and the 9th is Dr. Quentin Fairchild." Ember felt the pulse in her neck beat once in a way she couldn't hide. The third was an envelope sealed with red wax, stamped with the Orsini family crest, with only one line written on its surface in Hugo's handwriting: "Open only once betrayal has been verified." Thaddeus pushed the envelope toward her, but didn't let her hold it yet. "You aren't allowed to open it tonight," he said. "You must wait until Callahan comes home. The two of you open it together." That was Hugo's instruction, and I swore to keep it. "But I'll tell you the final thing you need to know before you return to Long Island, because it will change the way you see everything in that house." 2 months before Hugo died in what was called a traffic accident on the Cross Bronx Expressway, he hired me to prepare a unilateral divorce filing against Margot, with the legal basis being an affair lasting more than 12 years, with a trusted member of the Beaumont family in New Orleans. And the evidence is inside this safe: photographs, Swiss bank account statements, and 3 recorded voicemails that Hugo personally installed on her private phone. Hugo had scheduled the filing for May 17th. He died on May 11th. Ember. 6 days. No one else in the family knew about that plan except him and me. Ember sat still in the wooden chair, both hands wrapped around the cup of tea that had gone cold. And she understood that the woman sitting in the Orsini mansion on Long Island, the woman pouring milk for her every night with falsely gentle hands, didn't only want to erase her unborn child. She had erased a man before, and she had been very good at it. The return Vermonter train brought Ember back to Moynihan Train Hall at 2:47 on Wednesday afternoon, and she stepped out of the station with the red wax-sealed envelope hidden inside the lining of her backpack. No one in the Orsini family knew where she had been for the past 30 hours except Bernard, whom she had texted to say that the doctor wanted to keep her overnight for additional testing at the hotel across from the clinic. Bernard picked her up and drove her back to Oyster Bay at 5:15 in the afternoon. And when the Mercedes glided through the iron gate, Ember saw a black Maserati Quattroporte parked in front of the greenhouse in the mansion's south wing. The car she immediately recognized as belonging to Finn Orsini, Cal's 32-year-old cousin, the man Cal had called his brother for the past 30 years, the man who had stood as best man at their wedding, and the second name on Hugo's list of 14. Ember told Bernard to stop the car at the main roundabout, saying she wanted to walk in the rose garden for a while to gather herself after the long trip. And Bernard nodded and drove toward the garage, but Ember didn't go into the rose garden. She circled around the back, following the low stone wall covered in ivy along the west side of the greenhouse, a curved glass Victorian structure Hugo had built for his mother in 1987. And when she drew closer, she heard Finn's voice drifting out through an open ventilation window. She didn't allow herself to breathe. She only pressed her back against the wall, tilted her head, and listened. "Yes, Aunt Margot, nothing's going to happen." It was Finn's voice, the familiar deep voice she had heard so many times at family dinners, but now carrying a tone Ember had never recognized before, the tone of someone reporting not to a friend's mother, but to a superior. "Callahan will stay in Chicago for 2 more weeks. I've already arranged everything with the Brooklyn Harbor Group. They'll drag the negotiations out long enough. No one suspects anything. You just handle your part in Long Island. My side is already settled." A silence. Then Finn's voice dropped lower. "I understand, Aunt Margot. When Callahan comes back, everything will already be too late for that little girl, and once her matter is handled, we'll move forward with the rest exactly according to the plan you and I discussed in Sorrento last summer." Ember backed away from the wall, one step at a time, her heart beating in her ears, and she returned to her bedroom with the posture of a tired wife just coming home from an obstetrics clinic. She locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and closed her eyes for 30 seconds to force herself to remember every exact word she had just heard, because overheard evidence without a recording exists only in the listener's memory for 48 hours before it begins to distort. Finn wasn't only helping Margot handle Ember. Finn was arranging for Cal to stay in Chicago for 2 more weeks, the stretch of time Thaddeus had warned her about when they parted at the Burlington platform the night before. Finn wants the throne. Finn will never be satisfied with the position of underboss. His plan is to have Cal die in an accident exactly like his father, and he is willing to wait until Margot finishes handling the daughter-in-law first, so no one will suspect the 2 deaths are connected. Over the next 3 days, Ember called Cal a total of 19 times. The first 3 calls went straight to voicemail after 1 ring, something Cal had never once done to her in all 18 months they had known each other. The next 7 calls had no signal. The final 9 were blocked immediately by an automated male voice, saying the number was currently unavailable. She wrote a handwritten letter in blue ink on cotton paper, 3 pages, not mentioning the drugs or Margot, only saying, "I need you to call me back. Something isn't right at home. I love you." And she gave the sealed envelope to Constance with $200 as payment, asking her to send it by FedEx Priority to Cal's Chicago office. 36 hours later, Ember saw her own letter through the crack of Finn's office door when he stepped out to get water, the envelope still intact, lying in the unsent mail tray on his desk. On Saturday morning, a friend of Piper's sent her a TMZ link, and on the front page was a high-quality paparazzi photo of Cal having dinner at Chicago Cut Steakhouse on North LaSalle Street at 8:15 on Friday evening, his white shirt open at the collar, and across from him sat Rosa Beaumont in a tight black dress, tilting her head as she laughed, one hand resting on Cal's wrist, with the TMZ caption reading, "Dawn of New York seen with the New Orleans heiress. Marriage on the rocks." Ember sat on the second-floor bathroom floor for 40 minutes. She cried without sound, her shoulders trembling in the exact rhythm with which she had cried in the Bronx funeral home on the day her father was lowered into the ground when she was 22. The moment she had thought she would never cry like that again in her life. But at the 41st minute, she stood, washed her face with cold water, looked into the mirror, and said aloud, very softly, to the pale face staring back at her, "That photograph is fake. Or that dinner was a trap Rosa set for the photographers. He loves me. I believe that the way I believe the chemical reaction between 2 substances doesn't change when all conditions remain unchanged. And the conditions between him and me haven't changed, not once." On Monday morning, at exactly 8:40, the landline in Ember's bedroom rang, and on the other end was the voice of Sister Teresa Mulligan, the director of St. Vincent's Children's Home in Astoria, her voice trembling slightly in an unusual way. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm sorry to call this early, but we need you to confirm an urgent procedure. A couple from Greenwich, Connecticut, completed the entire emergency adoption file for Milo this morning. The paperwork was processed through Queens County Family Court within 72 hours. All documents bear the signature of the legal guardian. They picked the boy up at 7:30, and under state law, we're not allowed to disclose his new address during the first 90 days to ensure a smooth family transition. I'm very sorry, Mrs. Holloway. I know you visit often, but everything was done according to procedure." Ember didn't cry. She didn't scream. She only asked one question in a voice stripped of all emotion. "What are the names of that couple?" And Sister Teresa stayed silent for 4 seconds before answering, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Holloway. I really am not allowed to say." Then she hung up. Ember put the phone down. She stood motionless in the middle of the bedroom for exactly 17 seconds. And at the 18th second, she realized that call was the call Margot had been waiting for. The final blow the woman had planted from the first day Cal sent a nurse to Milo's children's home. 9 minutes later, when Ember was walking down the stairs on legs that felt as if they no longer belonged to her, Margot was standing in the kitchen, holding a cup of espresso, and she didn't need to turn her head to know Ember had heard the news. "Daughter," she said in a voice as smooth as wet silk, "I hear from Constance that you've just received an unhappy call." Ember stood at the kitchen threshold, not stepping inside. 72 hours, Margot said, setting her cup down on the saucer. "My lawyer will bring the divorce contract and transfer agreement to your sitting room at 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. You'll sign in the exact 14 places, marked with gold stars. You'll receive $5 million instead of the $2 million from the original offer, and within 12 hours after your signature is notarized, your brother will be returned safely to St. Vincent's as though nothing ever happened. If you refuse, if you run, if you say a word to Callahan, or if you try to contact anyone outside this house, Milo will vanish forever into an international adoption system that even the FBI can't trace. and you'll spend the rest of your life searching for a 9-year-old boy whose name has been changed, whose birth certificate has been changed, and whose face will be changed too if necessary. Do you understand me? Ember looked at her. She didn't cry. She only said in a voice Margot had never heard before, low, even, almost calm, "Give me 48 hours to think, ma'am. By 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, I'll call and give you my answer. I need time to put everything in my head back in order." Margot looked at her, and for the first time in nearly 3 months of marriage, Ember saw a faint flicker of suspicion pass through the woman's eyes. But then she nodded. "Fine. 48 hours. My clever daughter-in-law." Ember turned, climbed the stairs, returned to her room, and locked the door. She didn't sit down. She opened the second drawer of the vanity table and took out a black USB drive encrypted with AES 256-bit, which she had prepared 3 weeks earlier, containing the entire 3 months of evidence, Piper's lab results, photos of the dying orchid taken week by week, the recording of the kitchen conversation with Margot that she had secretly captured through her Apple Watch, photos of Fairchild's Patek Philippe, a scanned copy of Hugo's list of 14 names, and the voice recording in which she read aloud, word for word, the conversation with Finn in the greenhouse, right after she returned to her room. She placed the USB on Cal's pillow, his side. Then she lay down and waited. At exactly 3:07 in the morning, while the late autumn rain was tapping softly against the window, the bedroom door swung open. No knock, no warning. Callahan Orsini stood there, his gray Tom Ford suit rumpled after the night flight, his tie loosened, his hair wet with rain, and his gray eyes bloodshot in a way Ember had never seen before, the way a man looks after not blinking for 7 hours straight. He didn't say hello. He didn't embrace her. He only closed the door behind him, locked it twice, pulled a black Samsung phone she had never seen from the inside pocket of his jacket, and said in a thick, hoarse voice, "Thaddeus called me at 10 o'clock last night. I was on a plane within 45 minutes. I flew under a false name with a Canadian passport belonging to a friend. I entered the house through my father's old tunnel beneath the greenhouse, the one Finn doesn't know about." He sat on the edge of the bed, looked at her, and said the thing she had been waiting 78 days to hear. "I wasn't in Chicago to negotiate Brooklyn Harbor, Ember. I was in Chicago working with a special agent of the FBI named Elena Vasquez. She warned me 6 months ago that a mole had been planted inside the Orsini family at least 3 years ago. I've suspected Finn since my father's funeral, but I had no proof. I had to go away so Finn would expose himself. And I left you alone in hell because I thought my mother only hated you. I never imagined she would go this far. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Ember said nothing. She only picked up the USB from Cal's pillow, placed it in his palm, closed his fingers around it, and said in a low voice that didn't tremble, "I've been ready since the 12th night." Cal looked down at the USB, then looked up at his wife's face, the woman he had thought he needed to protect, and in that moment he understood that he had never married a victim. He had married a general who had already arranged her battlefield from day one, and all she needed from him wasn't salvation, but a man trustworthy enough to come home on the right night, the 67th night. Cal placed the USB on the bedside table, then took from the inside pocket of his jacket the red wax-sealed envelope. Thaddeus Winterbourne had handed him personally at Teterboro Airport 2 hours earlier, the envelope on which Hugo had written in midnight blue ink, "Open only once betrayal has been verified." He looked at Ember for 1 second, nodded, and she nodded back. Cal broke the red wax with his thumbnail, and he spread the 3 stacks of documents inside across the white bed. The first stack was a single page from Banque Julius Baer in Zurich, stamped with international notarization, clearly listing a trust account under the name Hugo Anthony Orsini Trust, with a balance of $63,200,000 United States dollars, linked to a dead man's switch protocol, programmed to activate automatically if Callahan Orsini failed to log into the 2-factor authentication system by fingerprint and voice at least once every 90 days. Hugo had set it up exactly 3 months before he died. If Cal died under unnatural circumstances, the entire $63 million would be transferred immediately to St. Jude Children's Hospital in Memphis, along with an electronic copy of 412 pages of black ledgers Hugo had stored over 26 years in business, money laundering transactions, shadow contracts, underground gambling branches connected to the Beaumont family in New Orleans, enough to send the 14 names on Hugo's list to federal prisons for anywhere from 7 years to life without parole. The second stack was an 8-page legal contract drafted by Thaddeus's office, signed on 3 sides by Hugo, a notary, and 2 independent witnesses, confirming that all legal assets of the Orsini family, the chain of 17 Italian restaurants across 3 states, 3 office buildings in Manhattan, and the real estate investment fund worth $180 million, would be transferred to the St. Jude Fund if Callahan died from any cause other than natural causes, as determined by 3 independent forensic doctors. Hugo had stripped Margot of her inheritance with a single handwritten line at the bottom of page 8. His handwriting slightly trembling from chemotherapy. "The woman I called my wife for 34 years is not to receive $1 from this estate. The reason is recorded in the attached envelope." The third stack was a hand-drawn diagram in pencil on graph paper, a layout of the ground floor and second floor of the Orsini mansion, with 7 small circles marking the positions of 7 hidden cameras in the house. 4 circles were outlined in red, 3 in blue. The 4 red cameras had been installed by Hugo 5 years before he died, independent of Margot's system, transmitting data directly to a server located in a rented house in Tarrytown, the address known only to Thaddeus and now Cal. One of those 4 cameras was inside the Murano chandelier above the grand dining table, capturing the full view of every seat. The system access password was Cal's birth date reversed, 70911-988. Cal logged in using the black Samsung phone that very night, and the recording system had been operating continuously for the past 73 days, capturing every dinner, every phone call Margot made in the dining room, every time she entered the tea room carrying the Earl Grey tin. By 4:12 in the morning, when the second cup of black tea had gone cold on the table, Cal and Ember had finished building the plan. At 7 o'clock on Wednesday night, the day after tomorrow, Cal would personally call and invite the entire family to the Orsini mansion for an important family dinner, the official reason being that he had just returned from Chicago with a major agreement to announce, and the guest list would include Margot, Finn Orsini, 4 senior capos, Dr. Quentin Fairchild, and especially Don Salvatore Beaumont and his daughter Rosa Beaumont, who would be invited from New Orleans as strategic partners. Thaddeus would arrive unexpectedly at the final minute. Neither Margot nor Finn was allowed to know that Cal had returned to Long Island. He would remain locked inside the bedroom throughout the next day. Constance would be the only one who knew, and she had received direct instructions from Hugo 4 years earlier that whenever Callahan returned in silence, she was to obey Callahan first. Running parallel to the dinner, at exactly 7:15 on Wednesday evening, Rowan Ashford, a former lieutenant of SEAL Team 6 who had left the Navy in 2017 and had worked privately for Cal since then, would lead a 4-man team in a raid on a detached house in Greenwich, Connecticut, which Ember had located through the secret GPS message she had installed in Milo's breathing machine from the first day the boy entered the children's home, a medical tracking device Cal had quietly asked the doctor to install without anyone else knowing. Rowan already had the house layout, information on the 2 amateur guards Margot had hired through a security company in Stamford, and an operation time aligned with the moment Cal raised his glass in the dining room. When Cal turned off the Samsung screen at 4:48 in the morning, Ember looked at him and said, "If we're wrong by even 1 step, Milo will die, I'll be infertile, and you'll be next." Cal took her hand, placed it against his chest, right over the heart beating slow and steady, and he said, "We won't be wrong, because my father set this chessboard 4 years ago, and he never lost a single game in his life." At exactly 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening, the Orsini mansion in Oyster Bay looked like an opera staged for a single audience member. Constance had spread a black Sicilian linen tablecloth embroidered with silver thread, arranged 12 seats around the 4-meter-long walnut dining table, lit 16 beeswax candles in Hugo's silver candlesticks, and at the center of the table stood a baccarat crystal vase holding 1 single white lily, the exact flower Donna Isabella, Hugo's mother, had placed at every important family dinner for half a century. The guests arrived one by one. Margot Orsini Vance wore a floor-length black dress with the 6-strand pearl necklace Hugo had bought her for their 10th wedding anniversary around her neck, and when she entered the dining room and saw that Cal's seat at the head of the table had already been set, she frowned for the briefest moment before sitting down in the seat of honor on the right. Finn Orsini arrived at 7:06, wearing a navy suit cut in Milan, and during the first 2 minutes he checked his phone 3 times with the frequency of a man waiting for a confirmation message that wasn't coming. Don Salvatore Beaumont, 67 years old, his silver hair combed back, arrived with his daughter Rosa in a tight burgundy silk dress at 7:10 on a private flight from New Orleans, and Constance brought them into the dining room with the solemnity reserved for the most important allies of the night. Dr. Quentin Fairchild arrived at 7:14, alone, the Patek Philippe still on his left wrist. The 4 senior capos of the Orsini family, men who had followed Hugo since the 1990s, sat in order of seniority at the far end of the table. At exactly 7:15, the dining room door opened, and Cal walked in with Ember. He wore the black 3-piece Brioni suit his father had left behind, and she wore a simple black V-neck dress with the emerald necklace Hugo had given Cal's mother. The entire table stood. Margot turned deathly pale for 1/10 of a second before her smile returned. Finn set his glass down at exactly a 45-degree angle. Rosa Beaumont tilted her head, her cold metallic smile stiffening. Cal didn't say hello. He walked straight to the head of the table, filled all 12 crystal glasses with the bottle of 1985 Barolo his father had kept in the cellar for 40 years for the most important occasion of his life, then raised his glass, looked across every face in turn, and said in the low, hoarse voice no one in the room dared interrupt, "Tonight we haven't come here to eat. We've come here to cut open the festering abscess that has been rotting inside this family since the day my father died." He set the glass down, pulled a remote from his inside pocket, and the walnut wall behind him split in two, revealing an 85-inch Samsung screen with 4K resolution that he had ordered installed inside the wall the year before, without anyone in the room knowing. The screen lit up. The first video came from the Murano chandelier camera, clearly marked September 15th, 9:07 in the evening, showing Margot entering the kitchen, opening the Earl Grey tin, dropping 3 drops of clear liquid into a glass of warm milk already prepared on the silver tray, stirring exactly 3 times clockwise, then walking upstairs. The angle changed to 3 different nights across 3 consecutive weeks. The same action, the same tin, the same glass of milk. The dining room went dead silent. The burning candles could be heard as clearly as an engine. The next slide showed 3 toxicology test results. The first from NYU Langone, signed by Piper Lockwood. The second from a private Quest Diagnostics lab in Teterboro. The third from the John Jay College Forensic Toxicology Institute that Cal had commissioned the previous week. And all 3 confirmed the same mixture of modified misoprostol and a leuprolide derivative, with a dose capable of causing permanent infertility within 90 to 120 days. The third slide showed a $2 million transfer contract from a shell company named Fairmont Consulting LLC, registered in the Cayman Islands, to Dr. Quentin Fairchild's personal account at HSBC Singapore, signed on February 14th of last year, exactly 1 week before Cal's wedding. Fairchild sprang to his feet and knocked over his chair. The fourth slide, perhaps the one that made Rosa Beaumont turn pale the fastest, was a marriage contract in Italian, drafted by the law office of Caruso and Associates in Palermo, signed by 3 parties, Margot Orsini Vance, Don Salvatore Beaumont, and Rosa Beaumont, notarized on November 19th, exactly 3 months before Cal and Ember's wedding, with the main clause committing Rosa to marry Callahan Orsini within 18 months after his current marriage ended by divorce or by natural causes, along with the merger of New Orleans Port Territory into the Orsini Empire. Margot shot to her feet, her hands shaking, and she screamed in a voice that had never once risen that high in the past 11 months. "This girl is a fraud, son. She's staging everything to steal the Orsini fortune. She's the daughter of a mechanic from Queens. She isn't worthy of our blood." Cal turned back, looked at his mother with gray eyes that had gone frozen solid, and said in a very quiet, very even voice, "I know you killed my father, Mother." At that exact moment, the dining room door opened, and Thaddeus Winterbourne stepped inside, his wool coat still dusted with snow across the shoulders, his old brown leather briefcase in his right hand. He placed the briefcase on the table, unlocked it, pulled out a 32-page forensic report stamped by the Federal Medical Examiner's Office in Boston, and said, "I had Hugo's body exhumed last August with Callahan's secret consent. 3 independent experts confirmed the same result. His blood contained a warfarin concentration 40 times higher than the usual cardiovascular therapeutic dose. None of Hugo's prescriptions listed warfarin, but there is a prescription under Margot Orsini Vance's own name at the CVS pharmacy in Glen Cove, filled every month for 14 months before the so-called accident." Finn Orsini lunged toward the dining room's back door. Two of Rowan Ashford's men were already standing there, and they locked his arms in the third step. Don Beaumont rose slowly, put on his coat, and said to Cal in Italian, "The Beaumont family withdraws from every agreement signed with this woman. Allow us to leave in peace. My daughter didn't know the details, and if the Council of the Five Families convenes, we'll testify." He took Rosa by the wrist, and father and daughter walked out of the dining room without looking back. At that exact second, the phone in Ember's dress pocket vibrated, and she took it out, placing it to her ear with both hands slightly trembling. Rowan Ashford's low, rough voice came through on the other end. "We got Milo out of the Greenwich house at 7:19. The boy is having a mild asthma attack, but he's stable. The ambulance is taking him to New York Presbyterian. It'll reach emergency in 3 minutes. You can video call him once he's stabilized." Ember set the phone down on the table, and for the second time in a year, she cried. But unlike the night on the bathroom floor when TMZ posted the photo of Cal and Rosa, this time the tears fell in silence, and on her pale face beneath the candlelight, they were the tears of a woman who had just won a war no one in the room had realized she had declared since the second night. While Ember was still pressing the phone to her ear, listening to Rowan Ashford report Milo's condition, Finn Orsini wasn't completely restrained. Within the 12 seconds immediately after Rowan's two men pinned his arms, Finn used the one advantage anyone born with Orsini blood in this house would know: the servant tunnel system built in 1932 to move bootleg liquor during Prohibition, and among the house's 7 secret passages, the route between the wine cellar beneath the dining room and the southern greenhouse could only be opened by a lever hidden in the leg of the 8th chair at the dining table. Finn kicked that lever with his heel in less than a second. The oak floor beneath his feet tilted open, and before Rowan could react, Finn grabbed Dr. Fairchild by the collar and disappeared down the stone stairs under the floor. They ran through the 180-foot tunnel, came up through the hidden door in the greenhouse, and escaped to the eastern auxiliary parking area, where Finn's Navy Aston Martin DB11 was waiting. 22 minutes later, the car was speeding down Sunrise Highway toward Sag Harbor, and Finn called his private captain, a man named Wyatt Brannigan, ordering him to prepare the 72-foot Azimuth yacht, named Black Orchid, to leave within 20 minutes. Destination Nassau, Bahamas. Finn didn't run empty-handed. Over the past 3 weeks, he had secretly copied the 21-digit password to the Orsini offshore account ledger. The ledger Hugo had once called the family's nuclear key, the ledger that only Callahan was supposed to have permission to access. Finn had read it secretly for the last time 11 days earlier, while Cal was still in Chicago and the library safe had been opened by a small mistake from Thaddeus. Once aboard the yacht, at 8:53 in the evening, Finn opened his Surface Pro laptop in the main cabin, connected to the Starlink Marine satellite network, and logged into the Bank Julius Baer electronic portal in Zurich using that 21-digit password. The screen displayed a green line. Login successful. Hugo A. Orsini Trust Account. Balance $63,200,000. Finn smirked, turned to Fairchild, and said, "Almost done, Doctor." But when he clicked the transfer button, the screen didn't show an entry form. It flashed red once, then it shifted into a deep red like clotted blood, and at the center of the screen appeared a single line in the black Garamond font Hugo had loved for 30 years. Only a traitor needs to use this key, and only a devil would try to sell his father's legacy. Over the next 3 seconds, the dead man's switch Hugo had installed 4 years earlier activated exactly as designed. 412 pages of digitized documents were automatically sent as encrypted emails to the FBI District of Columbia office, the DEA OCDETF unit at the New York field office, the IRS Money Laundering Investigation Division at the Brooklyn Center, and the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. At the same time, an encrypted GPS signal was activated and sent to the United States Coast Guard Command Center for the Long Island Sound area, with the exact coordinates of the Black Orchid yacht. 12 minutes later, 3 response boat medium Coast Guard vessels and 1 MH-60 Jayhawk helicopter surrounded Black Orchid 2 nautical miles from the Sag Harbor dock. Finn rushed onto the aft deck, trying to throw the Surface Pro into the sea, but his hands were shaking so badly that the laptop slipped from his fingers and fell onto the teak deck. A Coast Guard officer jumped aboard and locked his hands just as he bent down to pick it up. Fairchild was found in the lower cabin bathroom, trying to swallow a USB card containing a backup copy of the $2 million contract. 3 days later, On Saturday at 8 o'clock in the evening, at Rao's restaurant on the corner of East and 114th Street in East Harlem, the 15-table restaurant the Pellegrino family had operated since 1906, and where the Commission of the 5 families of Cosa Nostra had held sit-downs since the time of Carlo Gambino, 5 men sat around corner table number 3. Don Salvatore Gambino, 72 years old. Don Anthony Lucchesi, 69 years old. Don Michael Bonanno, 74 years old. Don Vincent Genovese, 66 years old. And Callahan Orsini, the 5th representative. Thaddeus stood behind Cal's chair as honorary consigliere. Margot Orsini Vance was brought in through the kitchen door at 8:20, wearing a simple black outfit with no jewelry, and according to the Cosa Nostra ritual, for a female family member being judged for conspiring to murder her husband and son. She knelt on the old patterned tile floor worn down by 120 years of use. The discussion lasted 47 minutes in Italian. The verdict was read by Don Gambino in a low, even voice. Margot Orsini Vance was stripped of all honorary membership rights within the Orsini family, all personal assets under her name, including the Park Avenue apartment, the summer villa in Positano, and the trust fund worth $28 million, would be seized and transferred in full to St. Jude Children's Hospital in Memphis under the name Hugo Orsini Memorial Fund. She would be permanently exiled to the town of Corleone, Sicily, where she had been born, forbidden from returning to any territory of the United States for the rest of her life, and forbidden from contacting Callahan Orsini or any of his descendants in any form under the supervision of the Gambino family's Palermo branch. Finn Orsini and Dr. Quentin Fairchild, already in FBI custody, would be left to the federal legal system without interference from any family, and this was the unanimous decision of all 5. Finally, Don Gambino asked whether Callahan accepted the verdict. Cal sat still for 3 seconds. He didn't turn his head to look at his mother one last time. He only gave a single nod and said in Italian, "The Orsini family accepts." 6 months after the sit-down night at Rao's, the maple leaves in Vermont had turned a blazing red in late October, and the wooden house where Thaddeus Winterbourne had lived for 12 years now belonged to Callahan Orsini and Ember Holloway Orsini. Under a transfer agreement the former consigliere had signed without accepting a single cent, with only one condition, that the couple had to promise to have their child in the room where Hugo had once slept on the nights he came here to fish in the late 1980s. Lake Champlain that morning was flat as a mirror, a thin mist hovering about 1 meter above the water, and the first sunlight of October was passing through the maple canopy and falling onto the cedar porch where Ember sat in the old rocking chair, her feet resting on a wool pillow Constance had knitted for her at Christmas, and in her lap was Milo. The boy was now 10 years old, 5 centimeters taller than he had been in the spring, his skin rosy after 4 months of recovery at New York Presbyterian, where the leading pediatric cardiac surgeon in the Northeast had performed a 7-hour mitral valve repair, and now his heart beat steadily at 72 beats a minute, like a new Swiss clock. Milo was reading aloud from a children's adventure book in the bright, high voice of a child who had just been given life a second time, and Ember only smiled and listened, one hand resting on her little brother's pale blonde hair. Cal stepped out through the front door, holding 2 cups of real Earl Grey tea, the kind he ordered directly from Fortnum and Mason in London, without letting it pass through any tin that could hide anything at all, and he sat down beside his wife, handing her 1 cup. Ember took it with both hands, the warmth of the porcelain passing into her palms, and she took a sip. Tea was only tea. Cal placed his right hand on her stomach, just beneath her left rib, where it had now begun to curve outward slightly, and he asked very softly, "What did the doctor say?" Ember looked at him, her green eyes reflecting the color of the maple leaves. 3 months, she answered. "A little girl. She's healthy. Her heartbeat is 142 beats." The doctor said, "Every number is even better than average." Cal bent down and kissed her forehead, then lowered himself and kissed her stomach, and he said, "We'll name her Hugo Holloway Orsini, your name before mine, because without you, my father would never have had a grandchild who carried his name, and because my father spent the last 4 years of his life waiting for this girl named Holloway without telling anyone." Ember said nothing. She only leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and looked out at the lake, where the mist was slowly dissolving strip by strip beneath the sun, revealing the small fishing boats of local residents moving farther out. "There are women who pour milk for you not because they want you to live," she said softly, more to herself than to Cal, but because they need you to grow weaker so they can feel stronger. And when you've lived inside the fog long enough, the first light touching your face can look exactly like a miracle, even though it's really only the sun that has always been there, waiting for you to open your eyes. Ember Holloway Orsini's story is a reminder that truth doesn't need to scream in order to win. It only needs a steady hand, a heart patient enough to endure, and the belief that real love, when built on respect rather than possession, will always find its way back at the right time. Sometimes the most dangerous person in our life isn't the stranger in a dark alley, but the person sitting at the dinner table with us every night, the one who calls us by tender names and keeps smiling while counting down our final days. Always trust your intuition, because survival instinct is the last voice an honest heart can still hear when every other voice has begun to fade. And remember that true family isn't blood, but the people willing to stand beside you when the truth becomes most costly. If Ember's story has touched some part of your heart, please subscribe to our channel today and join us for stories that reach the deepest places of emotion, shared with you every day. Leave a like and share this video with the loved ones around you, so that more people can be given strength when they are facing quiet darkness inside their own homes. We truly want to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever had a moment in your life when your intuition saved you from something terrible before reason could understand it? Or have you ever had to stand firm alone inside a house where no one believed you? Leave a comment below and tell us your story. We read every single comment, and every story you share becomes a source of inspiration for us to keep creating more meaningful videos. Finally, we wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace in your heart every day, and sincere people beside you when you need them. Thank you for listening all the way to the final moments of this story, and we'll see you again in the next video, where we'll follow a character you may still remember very clearly from today's story, the daughter of the Beaumont family, the woman who walked out of the Orsini dining room in that burgundy silk dress that night, and the woman whose life is about to teach her a lesson far harsher than anything she ever imagined. Goodbye, and we'll see you again.